Hello and welcome again to Tales of the Wild, the science podcast which reveals interesting and unusual facts about the natural world through stories. This week we're going to talk about a very strange and unusual creature that lives underground. It's certainly not known for being the best looking of the mammal species, but I would say it's definitely one of the most interesting. There's plenty of weird scientific facts that we're going to learn along the way. Welcome once again to Tales of the Wild. It's a hot day in eastern Africa. Deep cracks in the red clay earth spread out like the web of a giant spider across the baked earth. The sun rises painfully slowly into the expansive sky, with its blood-red outline shifting and shimmering through the thermals. Were it not for the occasional passing shadow of a lone hungry vulture rising on these thermals, it would seem as though the morning itself was completely absent of any life form. Closer to the Earth's surface, where the heat becomes more intense, hidden in the shadow of a small tree, the scaly head of a Kenyan sand boa is barely visible above the Earth. His reptilian eyes, still and lifeless like two camera lenses, wait for any signs of movement. He had waited completely motionless already for 2 days. This is not unusual for many snake species that use this sit-and-wait feeding strategy. Some snakes have been shown to reduce their metabolism and therefore energy demands by more than 70%, which would be like us eating for only 2 instead of 7 days per week. Fortunately, this snake's waiting time was coming to an end. He had eyed a golden mole chasing an excited cockroach out of a crack in the earth. At the moment, the mole was well outside of his strike zone, so he would have to wait a little bit longer. The golden mole was scampering around in circles chasing the cockroach, who was tiring in the heat of the desert sun. Golden moles are blind, but they have incredible sensory capabilities, especially when it comes to detecting vibrations in the earth. To avoid the sharp teeth of a pouncing mole, the cockroach launched itself clumsily down a small round opening in the earth. It bounced uncontrollably off the sides of the hole on its way down. The golden mole hesitated a little, assessing the size of the hole and the size of her body. It was going to be a tight fit. Still, she had her heart set on catching this cockroach. They were one of her favorites, and she would hate for it to go to another greedy golden mole. She forced herself down the hole, almost collapsing the entrance as she went. She could smell the blood of the cockroach. It must have injured itself during the chase. It was not really blood, of course. Cockroaches and other insect systems don't use blood in the true sense of the word. You may have seen in movies and video games that insect blood is always this greenish-bluish color. That's actually quite accurate. They use a green or blue fluid called hemolymph for transporting nutrients around the body. It's not, however, used to transport oxygen like our blood is. Because of their small body size, they have no need to transport oxygen internally. They use something called a tracheal system, which is where air is drawn into the body via small openings called spiracles. The air is then forced through the tracheal system, which is basically tubes of air, and these supply all parts of the body with their oxygen requirements. This lungless system is also thought to be the reason why insects never grow that large, and I think we're all generally quite happy about that. Just to briefly dive a little bit deeper into that system, it works because the net rate of oxygen mass transport by diffusion is inversely proportional to the distance of diffusion. I'll say that again. The net rate of oxygen mass transport by diffusion is inversely proportional to the distance of diffusion. This basically means that the oxygen just entering the insect's abdomen can easily and quickly travel a few millimeters to reach parts that require it. But if the insect were, for example, as thick as a tree trunk, it would need some form of transport network to pump the oxygen to where it needs to be. Another way of thinking about it is if you irrigate a dry field with water, you could heavily water just one corner of the field, but the plants on the other side would die before the water diffused to them. The solution to this problem would be to use a network of hose pipes, and the blood vessels that we use are analogous to this when it comes to transporting oxygen from the lungs around the body. So insects are sufficiently small that oxygen diffuses immediately to where it's required. The cockroach was leaking a trail of this green-blue hemolymph substance, and the golden mole was following its scent and continuing to chase the animal. The tunnel seemed to go in all directions, and she was getting deeper and deeper. This place was a labyrinth. Her bulky body rubbed against the walls of the tunnel as she went. In some sections, she had to use her digging claws to make enough space. She was doing just that in one particularly narrow part of the tunnel when she suddenly sensed the vibrations of the cockroach just ahead of her. It was drinking some moisture that was collecting on the base of a root, probably to replenish the fluid it was losing. Finally, this was her chance. She forced the loose earth out of her way with her powerful forearms and pounced onto the little insect. She dispatched him quickly between her teeth with a loud crunch. She sat down munching on her well-earned snack and took in her surroundings. She seemed to have entered a vast network of tunnels. The air was very humid here and much cooler than it was on the surface. It was actually rather pleasant and a great relief to get away from that hot sun nearer the surface. She would remember this place and certainly not tell any of the other golden moles about it. It really was rather impressive. She had never been in the presence of this kind of architecture before. It was a little bit narrow for her preferences, but very well made. The echo made her realize how large this place really was. To her it almost seemed not from this world. She wondered if it was crafted by ancient beings from another planet. The thought dissolved the comfort that she had previously felt as she sat there devouring the cockroach, and an eerie feeling crept up her spine. It would have taken years for a single golden mole to make this, unless a few of them had worked together on it, but she couldn't imagine that. Her species was very solitary, and the thought of helping each other out with a project like this seemed really preposterous. Golden moles live by the golden mole rule: treat others as you expect to be treated, which in her world meant generally unfairly. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a very faint, soft pattering of footsteps could be heard coming towards her from down the tunnel. She froze. She could tell immediately it was not another golden mole. In her mind, she imagined the alien architecture that surrounded her and breathed in the cool, humid air. This was the first time she realized it was actually quite difficult for her to breathe down here, and this combined with the fear she now felt made her very lightheaded. She had to get out of here. She dropped the last cockroach piece and turned around to make a quick exit, but the tunnel behind her had collapsed in the commotion of catching the cockroach. She forced her head through a small gap in the earthy rubble and tried to dig her way through, but she became trapped. The footsteps were getting louder and louder, and she started to panic. She managed to pull her head out again and turn around, but she found that the other side behind her had also collapsed, and she was truly stuck. The footsteps were getting louder, accelerating even. The creature was so close now that she could hear its slow breathing. She could hear its heartbeat, but she could not sense any of its body heat. It was as if this creature was not living. Still, the vibrations in the earth got closer and closer, until they were right in front of her, and then suddenly it stopped. She waited for what felt like an eternity for her end to come, but nothing happened. When she slowly gained enough courage to reach out her heavily clawed paw to investigate, she felt something cold, naked. It felt like skin, a face, a hideously distorted face. Chills raced through her body, but she was so curious at this point she had to know more. She felt two small depressions, framing a pair of tiny eyes wedged into what felt like old wrinkled bare skin, like two buttons in an old leather sofa. She had never felt a face like that before. It made her very uncomfortable. As her clawed paws moved down towards the chin, things only got worse. Much worse. Two giant sets of shovel-like teeth protruded directly out of the creature's chin and upper lip. This was a creature of nightmares, and she was trapped both physically and mentally. She felt overwhelmed by fear and froze. Some time passed, and she started to think the creature must really be dead. The skin was cold and it was not moving. She chuckled to herself nervously, and the echo sounded weak in her sensitive ears, and only emphasized the size of this labyrinth, making her more uncomfortable. It was then that the creature suddenly let out a deep roar. She had never heard a sound like that before, and was so terrified that she found all of the extra strength she had needed to break free from the narrow tunnel, and with the adrenaline coursing through her body, she promptly raced upwards towards the fresh air. Like a rocket, she flew towards the exit, breaking down the tunnel walls all along the way. She did not hear anything chasing her, but she could take no chances. She was breathing fast, and now realized that these tunnels were totally deprived of oxygen. She became dizzy. It would not be long before she passed out, and that creature would be upon her. Although her senses had started to fail her, she managed to stay focused on the task and carried on chasing that fresh air. She was almost there, while in the back of her mind she knew the perils of being outside during the light of day, but it was infinitely better than her current situation, and she chirped with triumphant joy as the smell of fresh air became stronger and the exit was there. She shot out of that tunnel entrance like from a barrel of a cannon, and was promptly plucked out of the air with the jaws of a very patient Kenyan sand boa. Down in the tunnels, a young king was running and muttering excitedly to himself. Naked mole rats are extremely vocal. They have a much deeper pitched vocalization than most rodents because lower frequency sound waves travel further in this subterranean environment. In fact, these animals exploit this fact by using a special extra low frequency call to alert all members of the colony when there's the presence of a threat. Wedged between this young king's two giant sets of teeth was a large, juicy piece of root, which was scoring a jagged line in the wall of the tunnel as he went. The damage was quickly being repaired by a smaller worker who was simultaneously trying to keep up and smoothen out the wall again. This worker was in turn being supervised by another worker, who followed closely behind, barking orders and prodding with his teeth. The diet of the naked mole rat is made up almost exclusively of roots, and the water content of these roots also provides them with their entire daily needs of water. While the king and two workers moved along, they occasionally scrambled over other workers which they encountered in the tunnels. The tunnels were not built to accommodate any respect for personal space, and consequently it was not considered rude to walk over one another, merely a necessary part of life. It is rarely beneficial for rodents to build tunnels larger than absolutely necessary. This would only serve to invite larger predators into their homes. The young king and his two chaperones made their way steadily along the tunnel. The tunnels of naked mole rat colonies have been known to exceed 3 kilometers in length, but fortunately these individuals would not have to travel quite that far. The giant teeth protruding from the young king's jaws are specialized incisors. As with all rodents, these teeth grow indefinitely. This is a characteristic almost exclusively found in the rodent group of mammals. These teeth are called aradicular teeth and are composed of an outer layer of the hardest material in the mammalian body, enamel. This enamel forms the outer layer of the teeth, the one that faces the environment, and on the inside they're composed of a material called dentin, which is also very hard but a little bit softer. The difference means that they remain constantly sharp as they wear down faster on the inner side compared to the outer side. The term rodents comes from the Latin word rodere, meaning to gnaw, and this need to gnaw at things to keep the ever-growing teeth trimmed sets rodents apart from most other mammals. The teeth must be used extensively to stop them from becoming overgrown, which is why rodents like rats and mice and squirrels are often responsible for cable damage in homes. Something which sets naked mole rats apart from other rodents is that they can actually move each individual incisor separately, like a pair of chopsticks. This gives them much greater control as they carve their tunnels out of the tough earth. Large teeth like this require strong jaws, and the jaw muscles of the naked mole rat consist of a quarter of its entire muscle mass. The young king was using these impressive jaws to grip the root he was delivering to the queen personally as he ran along the tunnels. He could of course have given one of the workers the job, but he knew the queen would appreciate the gesture. He was halfway to his destination when he stopped suddenly in his tracks. The deep alarm call was echoing throughout the tunnels, and up ahead he could see that the tunnel was blocked by a rather plump rear side of another naked mole rat. It was running very quickly towards him in a backwards direction. This is something that naked mole rats seem to do from time to time, and they do it very well. That must be Gathy, the overweight good-for-nothing son of my old brother, he thought. Gathy was approaching very fast and not being careful at all. It was unusual for him to move at all, let alone to be moving at speed, and this concerned the young king.
"Hey Gathy, why don't you look where you're going?"
the young king asked angrily.
"Uncle, run, there's a monster in the tunnels up ahead,"
he shouted as he continued running backwards through the tunnel. The young king promptly dropped the root and ran backwards as fast as he could, partly to get away from this monster, but also partly to avoid being crushed by Gathy. His two chaperones had already scrambled away as soon as they heard the alarm call. Cowards. You just can't get the staff these days, the young king thought to himself.
"What did the monster look like, Gathy? Was it a snake?" "No, uncle. Its teeth were inside the mouth, not like ours. Its eyes were missing, and it had this horrible, smooth hair all over its body. It was truly hideous, and it touched my face with its huge claws. It was terrifying."
The young king shuddered at the thought of such an ugly being, and continued to lead his clumsy nephew to the queen to warn her. Meanwhile, the queen was waiting in her chamber. She was not known for her patience and was getting very hungry. She swiveled her huge 60-gram mass around, sending the previously feeding baby mole rats flying in all directions. They quickly scrambled back to her, jostling for optimal feeding positions on her bulging body. The rumor in the colony was that the queen was the most beautiful being in existence, and so it was declared by many of her suitors. Although being almost completely blind and living in permanent darkness, this had never been properly verified. It's not actually true that they're completely blind. They do have functional eyes, but the optic nerve is about 10% the size of that you would find in other rodents like gerbils. But this was a fact the queen chose to ignore when she received compliments from her suitors. Out of all the suitors, she had so far chosen 2 kings, and normally naked mole rats choose between 1 and 3 males to breed with. These kings, or pashas as they're sometimes known, are the father to her children, and contributed to the 70 or so individuals in this rather average-sized colony. She kept her eyes open for a 3rd king, but she was very young and in no rush. The older of her 2 kings was a close advisor, and the younger was more of a servant, and was currently fetching her this root as she had requested. But he was taking a very long time about it. Many of the other naked mole rats in the colony had not approved of the young king because of his strange accent. In fact, new findings published just last week by a research team from the Max Delbruck Center for Molecular Medicine revealed that naked mole rats have a different dialect depending on which colony they originated from. The individuals that have not acquired the local dialect, which needs to be learnt when the animals are very young, tend to be shunned by other individuals in the colony. In other words, naked mole rats are highly xenophobic. Interestingly, the paper describes how dialect integrity is partly controlled by the queen. When the queen dies and a new queen emerges, the individuals in the colony will start copying the accent of that new queen. So the young king had a very distinct dialect, and this had not gone unnoticed by the colony. The queen herself was very hesitant about accepting him as a suitor because of this fact. But in the end he had won her over because he was very good at food collection, and also because there was something very exotic about him, and she liked that. She sighed and rolled onto her back, squashing a number of her babies who wriggled out from underneath her. She was soon covered again in a blanket of squirming baby mole rats. Her exotic young king had better get back soon, she thought. She wasn't worried about him, of course. Down here in the underground, life was safe. They were protected from most predators, the temperature was a little bit cooler, and the harsh UV rays of the sun did not reach them. In addition to providing insulation from the cold, hair is used by many mammals to protect them from this UV light. And one theory about why naked mole rats are hairless is that they don't need the hair to protect them from UV light because they live underground. Actually, hairless is not quite the right term because they do have hairs. They have lots of whiskers all over their bodies, and these are presumably used by the naked mole rats to feel their way around their tunnel environments, and possibly also for detecting vibrations in the earth.
My lady, you must eat. I can go and fetch you roots from storage.
No, old king, you must rest your old bones. The young king will be back soon. The babies chirped happily on hearing this, and then quickly resumed feeding. The old king knew the queen was right. He was almost 30 years old now, but he certainly didn't feel it. 30 years was relatively senior for a naked mole rat, but not comparable to the short lifespan of every other rodent species. This is quite a remarkable feature of the species. Rats and mice, for example, tend to live from 2 to 4 years and rapidly deteriorate as they reach their respective older age groups. The incredible longevity of naked mole rats has baffled scientists for some time. It's been shown that unlike all other mammals, these rodents don't conform to the Gompertz mortality law, which states that as an individual gets older, the chances of death through disease and other environmental factors get exponentially higher. One of the many unusual observations that was made when people first started studying this species was that no individual was found to have malignant tumors, irrespective of age. When compared to other rodents, this is extremely unusual and prompted further investigation. While recent studies have indicated that naked mole rats can in fact develop cancer and do, they do so at a much lower rate than expected, and they seem to be highly resistant to it, to a degree unlike that of every other mammal species studied. It is thought that perhaps the microenvironment inside their bodies uses cellular mechanisms to reduce the incidence of cancer, but we don't fully understand yet. The immune system of the naked mole rat, very much like the outward appearance of the species, is oddly dissimilar from what we see in other mammals, including our own species. One innate mechanism that all mammals use to prevent cancer from developing lies in what are referred to as tumor suppressor genes. These genes are the blueprints for proteins which stop any overcrowding of cells. In addition to the usual tumor suppressor proteins, the naked mole rat has been shown to produce a unique protein, which is a fusion of two different tumor suppressor proteins called P16 and P27. It's thought that their unique ability to suppress cancers may lie in this novel protein, but it requires further study. When something like this is discovered, particularly in a mammal, it generates a lot of excitement in the scientific community, because if we're able to understand the mechanism behind this ability to prevent cancer, we might be able to find a way to use these mechanisms in our own species. But we're only at the tip of the iceberg in terms of fully understanding this mystery, and it may be decades before we can really understand how these mechanisms work. The old king was in great health for his age. Apart from slightly lighter and looser skin, and reduced activity levels, you might not know that he was old at all. His hearing certainly wasn't affected by his old age, and at this moment he heard the unmistakable low-frequency naked mole rat alarm call penetrate the walls of the chamber, shaking the dust from the ceiling and sending the babies scrambling behind their mother in fear. His almost blind eyes widened in surprise, and he waited, body tense, with his large teeth pointing menacingly towards the entrance. Something was coming. Just at this moment, a backwards-facing young king, followed promptly by the large rear end of her son Gathy, burst through the narrow opening and into the room. They were both gasping for breath. About half of the naked mole rat pups let go of the queen and ran over to the young king, chirping excitedly. They promptly lost interest and ran back to the queen to feed. "What is the meaning of this?" the queen asked angrily. "What's going on?"
My queen, a monster has infiltrated our colony.
The queen's eyes widened as she clutched the young king. "Are you hurt?" she asked.
No, I did not see the beast myself. Your son, Gathy, described the monster, and it sounds truly hideous. Missing teeth, covered in fluffy hair.
He looked at Gathy, who nodded in confirmation.
There was more hair than skin, uncle. It was horrible.
The old king, who happened to be the father of Gathy, and who had been listening patiently, raised a wrinkled, hairless eyebrow.
Did it have legs? Yes, sir, 4 of them. How large was it? About 20 centimeters, roughly twice my size.
Many more eyebrows raised at this. Gathy was not the smallest naked mole rat.
What color were the hairs? A sandy root colored, I think, sir. I'm not really sure. It was very dark. It gives me nightmares thinking about it. It was so hairy.
The queen winced when he said this, and covered the ears of the nearest baby, whose head had poked out from under her wrinkled fat folds.
Strong arms with claws? Yes, sir. How did you know?
The old king walked around, slowly muttering to himself.
What you're describing, my son, is a golden mole. While they are truly hideous in appearance and barbaric in their feeding practices, they are of no concern to our kind. We have long lived alongside these primitive tunneling beasts without trouble for centuries. They are all bark and no bite,
he said, tapping his overgrown incisors.
I wish I could say the same for your mother. When she's hungry, she's all bite. Gathy, go and fetch her a root from the stores. She has not fed for several minutes now, and the young are draining her.
Gathy, who was relieved by what he had heard, was not happy with having been given the task. He hated going to the deeper tunnels. Still, he gave a lazy nod and walked back out of the entrance to the royal chamber. As soon as he left the room, he called on a passing naked mole rat and told her to go to the deeper tunnels to fetch the queen some food. This naked mole rat nodded and ran off. After Gathy had left, the young king went to lie beside his queen. Happy that the threat was a false alarm, he relaxed, and he cast his eyes upon the queen. He admired her mostly with his non-visual senses, and wondered why he found her so enticing. Her body was longer than the other females in the colony. This is actually one of the features that makes this a eusocial species rather than a social species of mammal. Eusocial animals differ from social animals in that there are physical differences between individuals in different castes to help them to fulfill their particular role within the colony. The smaller of the workers focus on acquiring food and maintaining tunnels, while the larger workers are more reactive in cases of attacks. As in certain bee species, the workers are divided along a continuum of different worker caste behaviors, instead of having discrete groups. Some function primarily as tunnelers, expanding the large network of tunnels within the burrowing system, and some primarily as soldiers, protecting the group from outside predators with those powerful teeth and jaws. There are 2 main types of worker within the colony. The frequent workers, who frequently perform tasks such as foraging and nest building, and infrequent workers, that show some role overlap with the frequent workers but perform at a much slower rate. Gathy, the son of the old king, is certainly one of the latter and a rather extreme example. Female naked mole rats in the colony either take on the role of queen or they join the continuum of workers. Only the queen is fertile, and pheromones present in her urine prevent any non-dominant females from developing ovaries and a reproductive cycle. While there can sometimes be an uprising to dethrone the queen, mostly the other females must wait until the existing queen dies before they have a chance at being queen themselves. And as we've established, naked mole rats live a very long time, so this could take a long time even in human years. When this happens, the colony is no longer flooded with the pheromones that make the females infertile, and violent fighting can begin. The queen was getting very irritated. Firstly, she was hungry. Secondly, there was this false alarm. And now her young, naive king was just lying down and staring at her instead of working. She looked him up and down. In better light, with better eyes, she would have seen that, like all dominant naked mole rats, his body was slightly larger than that of the workers. Unlike the females in the colony, the males are all capable of reproduction, but only 1 to 3 males will breed at a time. Those individuals are dominant and grow slightly larger than the non-breeding individuals. The queen cast her eyes outside of the entrance and saw that Gathy was still there. He must have delegated the task of fetching a root to one of the other workers, she thought, and she was angry and disappointed but not surprised. Her useless overweight son was simply an embarrassment to the colony. Gathy didn't help with anything. She had tried to talk to him about it several times, but he simply refused. She sighed to herself. She had hoped Gathy would one day grow up to be a king, but this seemed increasingly unlikely. The old king seemed to read her mind and went outside to speak to him.
You know, son, the only way this works is when we all work together. We all have days like this, but you've been like this your whole life and it has to stop. You have to help out.
I'm not interested in digging or fetching things, Gathy replied in a sulky tone.
Look at you, boy. Your laziness has made you fat. You can barely fit through the tunnels anymore, and the others are all laughing at you. If you can't do it for the colony, you should do it for yourself. A bit of exercise would do you the world of good, and your mother would be so proud of you. You remind me of another son we had many years ago. He never felt like part of the colony. He never did any work, he just ate, and then one day he just left. I don't want you to follow that same path,
the old king said, with tears in his eyes. Gathy was quiet and looked at his father. While he didn't look so old, he certainly had started to repeat himself more often. Gathy had heard this story about another son leaving the colony hundreds of times, and whenever he asked for more information, the king would not say anything else about it, perhaps out of fear that it might spark further interest in his son. Gathy could not bring himself to tell his father that he had long dreamed of leaving the colony. It was in fact all he could think about. He hated it here, stuck with all his brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, nephews and nieces. Everything was so incestuous, and he felt like a prisoner in his own home. To make matters worse, he was continuously being picked on for being overweight and for not working hard enough. But he was not a digger, and he never would be. He wanted more from his life. He wanted to see the world. He dreamed about meeting other naked mole rats from other colonies and hearing their stories. He would love to explore the tunnels they had created, but he knew that this would never be allowed. What he did not know is that one day he would leave. It was in his blood to do so, or rather his genes. The old king sighed with relief after finally having convinced his disobedient son to go out and fetch some more food for his queen mother. That's what he thought anyway. But all of that backwards running had made Gathy hungry, and he had other ideas about what he would do when he reached the food storage chamber. The food was stored in much deeper tunnels where the temperature was cooler, and it was less likely to spoil. He didn't like going there much because, unlike other mammal species, naked mole rats are not endothermic. Endothermic animals produce their own body heat using their metabolism or by shivering. Naked mole rats, like reptiles and most fish species, rely on their local environment to control their internal body heat. Animals that use this strategy are known as poikilotherms, and this is why you often see reptiles basking in the sun after consuming a meal. The enzymes in their stomach are dependent on warmth in order to digest their food. The conditions in the naked mole rat tunnels average around 30 degrees, which, while much cooler than outside, is not that cold. But if they do get cold, they tend to huddle together to reduce their surface area to mass ratio. Kathy didn't like venturing down to the food storage chamber because it was a little bit cooler, but the reward would be worth it. As he went down deeper into the tunnel, the oxygen levels dropped to around 5%. Studies have shown that naked mole rats will go about their daily business apparently unaffected by this low level of oxygen for several hours. To put this in perspective, oxygen usually makes up around 20% of atmospheric air, but this percentage declines with altitude. At the top of Mount Everest, the oxygen percentage is around 7%. Most climbers at this level of altitude will use oxygen supplement tanks to survive the potential hypoxia that can occur in this situation. Naked mole rats, on the other hand, use a different approach. When environmental oxygen is low, naked mole rats have shown that they can switch from the more common approach of metabolizing glucose for energy to fructose instead. Fructose can be utilized by the body to generate energy using anaerobic respiration without the need for oxygen, and this makes the naked mole rats highly resistant to low oxygen levels. They can actually hold their breath for up to 18 minutes without any negative effects. When Gathy finally reached the food storage, he immediately began stuffing his face with roots. Without access to daylight, it was impossible for him to see what time it was, and he was getting sleepy. The circadian rhythm of naked mole rats, which is the hormonal fluctuation that influences our sleep and waking hours, is severely disrupted. Because they live permanently underground, they rarely see the light of day. They tend to sleep as a consequence at very irregular intervals, which can occur whenever they're feeling sleepy. Gathy lay down on a pile of roots and began to doze off. He was abruptly awoken by a low-frequency alarm call. He spat out the piece of root he had been chewing in his sleep and ran outside to see what the commotion was about. There was nobody there, so he continued to run up to the higher tunnels. When he got to the royal chambers, they were empty, and he could hear the others nearer to the surface. There was a lot of loud chattering. As he continued to walk upwards, he could see, silhouetted against the daylight from outside, was a cluster of workers blocking the entrance to the tunnel and barking angrily. He couldn't see what was behind them outside the entrance to the tunnels, so he asked one of the workers. Apparently a Kenyan sand boa, one of the greatest predators of naked mole rats, was seen in the area. At this point, Gathy felt a sharp prod in his back, which made him jump. It was his mother, the queen.
Get out there and help, Gathy. You're bigger than all of them. Block the entrance.
A few more pokes and Gathy ran towards the entrance, knocking the soldiers out of the way like they were bowling pins. They cheered as he ran out to face the threat. There was indeed a huge Kenyan sand boa right outside the entrance. Its lifeless eyes ignited an instinctual fear in Gathy, and he turned around and immediately ran back. He bumped straight into his uncle, the younger king.
Go and get him, Gathy,
he heard his mother shout, but he was terrified. He was caught between a Kenyan sand boa and his oppressive, disappointed mother. He looked up and saw another entrance to the tunnel and the clear blue sky. The young king noticed his gaze and patted Gathy on the back.
Go, boy. Get out of here. I'll deal with your mother.
What do you mean, uncle?
I'm not your uncle, Gathy. I came from out there.
Gathy had so many questions at this, but so little time. He saw his mother approaching angrily, and he saw the commotion of the soldiers fighting off the Kenyan sand boa. He looked up again at the blue sky, and then at the young king. Now he understood. The young king was not his uncle, because the young king came from a different colony. That explained the weird accent.
Maybe you're not my uncle,
Gathy said,
but I'm more like you than any of the others.
And with that he ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life. He shot out of the second entrance to the tunnels and into the daylight. The sand boa was distracted by the soldiers at the other entrance. Gathy noticed a large golden mole-shaped lump in the sand boa's belly. He ran as fast as he could. He looked back and saw his mother waving and shouting at him to come back. This was the first time he had seen her in daylight, and he was shocked by what he saw. She was bulbous, pink-skinned, wrinkled, with 4 yellowish, giant teeth protruding out of her face and framing a pig-like snout. Her black, beady eyes stamped into her pale face glistened in the light of day. The rumours are true, he thought. That must be where I get my good looks from. What the others couldn't understand is that Gathy really was not like them. Prolonged inbreeding in naked mole rat colonies eventually can be highly detrimental to the colony, and to really get to grips with this concept we need to understand what happens on the genetic level in inbreeding. Nearly all mammals are referred to as diploid. In genetic terms, this means that we have 2 possible versions of each gene. These are called alleles. They're responsible for things like whether you have blue or brown eyes. Some of these alleles are deleterious, meaning that they're not good for the survival of the organism. They exist because of naturally occurring mutations. This word mutation or mutant often carries with it negative connotations. We think of mutant zombies and 3-eyed fish. They're often described as mistakes, which they are, but these mistakes are very important for our evolution and continued survival. They are the mixing of new ingredients into the genetic soup. Now imagine in a certain individual a mutation has occurred, and now instead of having 2 healthy alleles for a gene, it has 1 deleterious allele for a gene. We don't want this. When individuals have 1 copy of these genes, they're fine, but when they have 2 copies, they might be, for example, born blind. This is where inbreeding really becomes a problem, because when inbreeding occurs, these deleterious genes become more common. There's not enough mixing of genetics to ensure that deleterious genes are filtered out by natural selection. Before you know it, all of the individuals are blind, assuming that they can survive long enough to reproduce. In some species where this has occurred, such as the golden mole, it has not been a problem. In fact, it was probably beneficial to conserve the biological resources that would otherwise go into maintaining an underutilized sense for a sand-dwelling creature. They don't need their eyes. Most of the time, though, it will have a negative impact on biological fitness. Risk of blindness is just one of 1,000 potential effects that deleterious genes could have if allowed to increase uncontrolled in the population by a lack of sufficient outbreeding. In our own species, this has famously occurred in many royal families where genetically inherited disorders such as haemophilia, which is the inability to produce blood clots, were common. In 1996, after much speculation about how the naked mole rats avoid these problems associated with inbreeding, it was discovered that there is in fact another caste that is both behaviourally and morphologically different to the worker and soldier and queen and king castes. These individuals have notably more fat reserves than other individuals, and they seldom participate in any of the colony work. They will leave the colony whenever they have the opportunity to do so, and they will only mate with non-colony members. This is known as the disperser caste, and their only role is to avoid inbreeding depressions. And that's exactly what Gathy is. Gathy looked back one last time to see his angry mother, his confused father, and his waving, smiling uncle as he ran away into the horizon and disappeared into a hole in the ground to start a new life. So that ends this week's tale. I think we'll have to revisit this species in the future because there's so much that we continue to learn about them. I chose the naked mole rat this week because they're very unusual on so many levels, and to be honest, I think we barely scratched the surface with this episode. It's essentially an almost blind, cold-blooded mammal that lives in a caste system with morphologically different individuals. There's so many things going on here, and I think we definitely need to revisit it. Next time, we're going back into the ocean, at least for the beginning of our wild tale. The creature that we'll follow has many interesting features, just like the naked mole rats, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it very much. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this episode, please support the podcast by sharing it with others, leaving a review, or sponsoring Tales of the Wild on Patreon. I've left a link in the description of this episode where you can see how to do that. See you all next time on Tales of the Wild.